I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Napoleon, 200 years since Waterloo. Napoleon, a man who is a mystery to modern America because our part of this story was America was inventing itself at the same time Napoleon was inventing himself. The new nation, America, in revolt from the British. You will recall, however, without the French help, Louis XVI's help, there is no America, there is no Cornwall. A Cornwallis defeat. There is no, in fact, new president, Washington. At the same time, the turmoil in France was creating a new man for the new century. His name was, well, that's part of the story. Napoleon, A Life by Andrew Roberts, tells the story of a man from the island of Corsica. He's born to Carlo, his father, and Maria Letizia, his mother. Corsica, however, is important to understand the man who becomes the leader of the French. I begin, however, by welcoming Andrew Roberts, congratulating him for his overwhelming work, and then asking a bibliographical question. Andrew, 33,000 letters, much of it new, much of it fresh information torn out of the hands of the propagandists for the last 200 years. You've read many of these letters. You've managed to solve his handwriting. What is it like to handle a letter written by Napoleon in the heat of battle or trying to win Josephine's attention? A very good evening to you.
Very good evening to you, John, and thank you very much indeed for letting me come on to the show. Yes, you're right. It is a task. There are an enormous amount of letters. Many of them have been published before, of course, and these are now published in the Fondation Napoleon's 12-volume series. There are going to be many more volumes, actually, by the end of it. But the thrill of actually touching letters that Napoleon wrote, actually, many of them are in New York at the Morgan Library, including some of the more erotic ones that he wrote to Josephine in the throes of passion when, as you say, he was on campaign in Italy. And it is really so exciting to see them. As I think you also mentioned, they are very difficult to decipher, owing to the fact that he had the handwriting of a drunken spider. And so, as a result, you have to really sort of parse out the sentences sometimes.
The education, we're going to do young Napoleon here, and his education is important because he's between several worlds. Corsica was part of the Genoese Empire for 200 years prior to the French taking it over. It's Italian, it's French, it's Corsican. And Bonaparte, Napoleon, represents those two traditions. So let's begin. This is a beautiful book. It's magnificent, and we're just focusing on the education. The young Napoleon, his father, Carlo. Is he gentry? Is that important to Napoleon's story?
Yes, it's very important. He's in this sort of penumbra between gentry, which is a good word for it, and the sort of lower aristocracy. But they haven't got any money. They're grand because the family has been on Corsica for 250 years, and they have the title of nobility. But they're poor as church mice, and so although they're very proud of being able to eat their own olive oil and bake their own bread and all of that. So they had enough land to do that. They didn't actually have any cash.
The father makes a political decision. Napoleon is born in 1769, and at this point there's turmoil on the island because the French are coming. And Carlo Bonaparte must choose between the patriots of Corsica, eventually led by a man named Paoli, but at this point there's also a sponsor they all worship, and the French, who land with 30,000 troops on an island of 140,000 people in 1772, and he dines with Conteval. Does Napoleon regard his father as a quisling? Is that a doubt that hangs over him?
It is, yes, because Napoleon, of course, as a young man, does the sort of opposite and becomes a great Corsican nationalist. He follows Paoli. He feels emotionally that the French are monsters to have, as he said, drowned my island in blood. He was very hyperbolic as a young man. And the thing is, though, that he also, a part of him understands that once Paoli had left the island and the and the Patriots had been defeated, that really there was no other possibility for his father other than to have made his peace with the incoming French.
The education of Napoleon. The first 9 years he speaks Corsican and he does not speak or write French. It's astonishing to me that he doesn't begin till 9. His father is a scholar. And you write that he's impecunious, that he's frivolous, that he has blue-gray eyes, which Napoleon inherits nothing but his father's eye color and his dad's. His mother, however, is a firebrand. She is uneducated. So which side does he take after?
Well, wonderfully both. He has the passion of his mother. His mother, who actually in the fighting against the French was with his father up in the hills when she was pregnant with Napoleon. I mean, it's pretty impressive to go on campaign when you're pregnant, but that's what his mother did. She was obviously a very strong-willed woman. But also, he had his father's love of books, love of conversation, and love of writing, and also his father's secularist Enlightenment beliefs, the sort of Voltairean beliefs that were fairly rare on this very Catholic Mediterranean island.
Yes, let's speak of the town. Ajaccio, do I say it correctly? What's it look like?
You do. Well, it hasn't changed that much, actually, now. It's a beautiful place with lots of lovely old buildings and a fine fort and a palace that Napoleon eventually controlled. And it's a sort of superb tourist holiday destination, really. But at the time that he was growing up there, it also had this important cathedral, which you can still go to. And it was his great-uncle who was the archdeacon of the cathedral, and really the man who kept the family together because they were always sort of struggling on the edge of bankruptcy. All
right, young Napoleon, the child who likes books. He says, or it is said, that he read Rousseau's novel Eloise at age 9. Is that Napoleon in older age boasting, or was there information of his mother saying that?
No. That's very much the truth. He was a bit of a child prodigy. He used to go up to his father's library and spend all his time there reading about Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar and his other great heroes. But he also read Goethe. There's The Sorrows of Young Werther, which is Goethe's great romantic work. He read that book 18 times. He was a vociferous and omnivorous reader, and one can see that very much in his writing.
And he read right away Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar. Did his father tell him to follow that path, to only pay attention to the commanders?
No. This was something that came from him. He wasn't destined, like his elder brother, for the church or for any other part of what the Bonapartes had done in the past, which was to go into the law or the church and sometimes academia. He was going to be a soldier from pretty much the earliest age, and he decided, or indeed a sailor, in fact, at one point he considered, but it was going to be that side of life that he followed, and therefore he read up about the great campaigns and soldiers of the past.
The king, Louis XVI, has scholarships for the Corsican youth, the best of the Corsican youth, and because of the political connections, Napoleon receives one of them, and in January of 79, according to my notes, correct me, Andrew, if I get this wrong, at the age of 9, almost 10, he goes off to study French because he's going to be admitted to an academy, Brienne-la-Château, on the mainland. He's going off to Burgundy with his father. When we come back, Napoleon at school. The book is Napoleon, A Life. Andrew Roberts is the author. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. Andrew Roberts is magnificent extremely romantic telling of Napoleon's life. It's a long and extremely exciting story, and we're focusing on young Napoleon, who's now been taken by his father. It is 1779. Consider what's happening in America at the same time. This is the age of enlightenment. It's the age of invent yourself. Off with the old, on with the new. Napoleon's off to a Royal Military Academy. First, he has to learn French. It's an astonishing fact, Andrew, that he spoke French poorly and that he was mocked in school at speaking French poorly. Did it worry Napoleon?
Not really, no. I mean, French was his third language after Corsican and Italian. And it was pretty impressive that he managed to pick it up in 3 months at all, really. But immersed, of course, as he was in France for his school days, he didn't have a single day's holiday in 6 years. He wasn't allowed to come home for 6 years, didn't see his mother for 6 years. So he picked up French pretty quickly. And he always spoke with this Corsican accent, which people mocked at school. His school friends and contemporaries mocked it. But then he was being mocked for lots of other things as well. His father wasn't very well off, so his richer school friends, this was a school for the aristocracy, mocked him, and he was mocked for being slightly smaller than the rest of his school friends. So, the poor chap had to put up with quite a lot of schoolboy ridicule anyway. He's taught by the Minim Order of Franciscan monks, and I paid very much attention to your detail of his schooling. Math, Latin, history, French, German, geography, physics, fortifications, weaponry, fencing, dancing, and music. And you mentioned that it's a bit of a finishing school as well. His German was weak, his geography was strong. Did he like it? Did he remember it later in life as a good start? Yes, he did. He was always very proud of his education at Brienne, and it was a very good school. It was one of the 12 academies that Louis XVI had set up for the nobility, and he actually later on in life did give money to his old school and gave money to some of his schoolmasters and found a couple of jobs for his schoolmasters. So he obviously did actually, despite all the teasing and the sort of minor bullying from his school contemporaries, he did actually admire the school. It was a Spartan life, and you say his nickname was the Spartan. Straw mat, one blanket, and one visit from his parents after 3 years, and he studied for 8 hours a day. But when the children, his classmates, were playing, he was sneaking off to read history. Again, he reads the lives of great men. This looks like Napoleon for dummies here. He reads Duke of Marlborough. He reads about Oliver Cromwell. Did his schoolmasters note the fact that Napoleon had a great affection for historical figures? Yes, they did. They spotted quite early on that he did well and that he was a bright lad. And when he was being tested, he did pretty well in tests. Not, though, as you mentioned earlier, in German and some other subjects, but in the ones that you really needed for a military career, geography, as you mentioned, mathematics, very important for an artilleryman. He did outstandingly well, which, of course, might be another of the reasons that he was bullied. Large head and a very small frame. His mother worried after 3 years when she visited that he looked thin, so clearly he was driving himself. I have a wonderful quote from you, Andrew. I was the poorest of my classmates. Was that a problem for him, that he didn't have pocket money, that he couldn't buy food for others? Yes, well, it certainly was, and later on in life he couldn't buy food for himself. It was, he was down to one meal a day, which is obviously going to have a psychological effect on you to some extent. But he didn't care about any of that. He had his head in the clouds in a way, being so intellectual at a place which was ultimately a military academy and therefore was a pretty rumbustious place. But nonetheless, he also, at this time, developed the ambition, really, that was to see him through. Let's go off to Paris, because he sits his final exams at Brienne in September of 1784, and he's appointed, or he wins an appointment to the École Militaire in Paris. Was that a status school? Oh, totally, yes. I mean, it was the equivalent of West Point or Sandhurst.
3 chapels a day, rising at 6 a.m., riding. You emphasize, especially in the Italian campaigns, that he was a tireless horseman. Is that typical of the time? Did everybody do well on horses? I remember Grant, the boast about Grant was that he was a great horseman, even if he didn't impress his classmates. Did Napoleon impress his classmates?
Yes, he did. And later on in life, actually, he'd do tricks with his horses. He'd make his horse ride backwards and things like that. He was a very fine horseman, which it was an absolute total prerequisite for the cavalry, of course. Not that important for the artillery, which is what he decided to go into. He was the first Corsican ever to study at the École Militaire, which is just about 200 yards away from where the Eiffel Tower is now. It's still there. It's a fabulous, wonderful 18th century building.
I went looking on Google Earth when you pointed that out, because I think I've walked over where the École Militaire was, and I didn't know it was there. And the next time I'm in Paris, I'll certainly go look.
Yeah, do. It has 17 different courtyards, including the one where Alfred Dreyfus was so monstrously humiliated.
The class of 1785, I'm taking notes from Andrew's extremely careful book. 202 candidates, 136 passed. And of those 136, only 14 were chosen by artillery. I did not know until your book, Andrew, that the choice of artillery was a status symbol at the time. Why?
Well, it was tremendously important in the 7 Years' War, which France had lost so comprehensively in the 1750s and 60s, and France knew that it needed to get the artillery right in order to win the future wars, and so they really concentrated on getting very good people in there, spending a lot of money, reading up about the latest inventions, trying to make cannons lighter and fire faster and further. And so it was understood that it was key to future victory.
And he studies artillery because it's a new science, but they teach him how, and I wrote down the details here, they teach him how to make his own gunpowder, how to cast his own cannon, how to build the carriage for the cannon, and I guess they taught him everything about range finding and where to move. Is he the first generation of of field artillery? Is this brand new to the battlefield?
A lot of it is, yes. It's some of the sort of basics of the cannons were almost exactly the same as in Marlborough's wars 100 years earlier. But he was very much on the sort of cutting edge of the new ideas, especially about how to use different metals to make cannons lighter and more maneuverable. Because if you can do that and you can attach them to horses and use it as horse artillery, it means that the whole battlefield entirely changes, where you can move your cannon around as and when the battle developed.
Which is exactly what Napoleon learns to do when they give him the command of an army. Andrew Roberts' his book is Napoleon Alive. Now that we've educated him, we commission him into the army. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Napoleon Alive. Andrew Roberts' magnificent book now takes us to Napoleon with his commission at 16. He's commissioned in Campagne d'Automne. Help me with this. 5th Brigade, 1st Battalion, Regiment de la Fère on the Rhone bank. Is that a good posting?
Yes, very good posting. The La Fère regiment is an old one. It's a very established one. It's a rather prestigious one. And this is exactly where he wants to be.
He lives simply again, though. A bed, a table, a chair, and he lives on charity. And he isn't polished. Is he aware of this? So do the other young officers mock him for it?
Yes, they did, but he was a bit more popular than at school because he'd proved himself intellectually, and He was more popular in the mess, and also they seemed to have been an awful lot less snobbish than they were than his schoolmates were. They were willing to treat a man on his merits rather than who his father was or how rich he was.
Remember those 33,000 letters? Well, they evidence themselves not just in the correspondence, but in the fact that this is a budding novelist. That's the great discovery here, Andrew. If he hadn't been the conqueror of Europe, he might have been a rival to the man eventually who writes about the battles that he fought, which would be Tolstoy. He was practicing his fiction. That's the only way I can imagine it at the same time. Did he envy Rousseau? Did he want to be a novelist? Did he ever write about it?
Yes, he was a huge wannabe novelist, and he put his... Very impressive when one thinks that he's writing in French, which was his third language. He puts in for writing prizes, especially the big one at Lyon, which if he'd won, he would have got as much money as he was being paid for the entire year as a lieutenant of artillery. But he didn't win. But he was constantly writing short novels, short stories, stories about, many of them deeply autobiographical, of course, but nonetheless also some that allow us into the psychology of this rather angst-ridden young intellectual.
Yes, he writes about his view of the world. He has a cosmology, and it's important now to investigate his religion, his piety, because you have this wonderful line where you say Napoleon is in the Enlightenment on horseback. That very much sounds like a modern man. Was he all by himself in this idea of rejecting the church's overlordship? Was he fresh to this, and did it cause him trouble with his friends that he wasn't pious?
Well, he was a follower of Rousseau like his father, read a lot of Rousseau and Voltaire, and that's really where he got his unbelief from, which was uncommon in the... you see a lot of it, of course, with the French Revolution, but in the pre-revolutionary period, it's both uncommon and pretty much illegal. He was very much on the sort of dangerous side, being an army officer and an unbeliever. So he played that down pretty much. He didn't want to draw attention to it. But yes, this was the period in which he lost his faith, if he ever had any.
And we do not know now whether there was a moment or not when he lost his faith. There's no particular incident that says, I don't believe in Christ.
No, well, as you'll remember, his great uncle, the benefactor of the family, the person who really stops them from going bankrupt, was the Archdeacon of Ajaccio. So he wasn't going to publicly distance himself from the Catholic Church, which, apart from anything else, could be very bad news for him politically and professionally. And so no, it's not something that he would have drawn attention to.
It's now 1789, and that's an important date, considering what will happen in the world. America is, at this point, organizing itself for a constitution, and Napoleon is responding or reacting to the first signs of the revolution. It doesn't start at the Bastille. It starts in the countryside, and I think his command is ordered to put down mobs. So that's when he first knew that there was trouble. Did he find 89 different than every other year? Did he recognize right away that this was going to turn France upside down?
Astonishingly, for a man who has such good political feeling and sense, no, it really passed him by. The greatest date, as you mentioned, 1789, probably in the history of modern Europe, and he missed the significance of it. He was busy, as you say, putting down mobs and riots in various small towns in southern France. He seems to have missed the huge cataclysm that was going on in Paris.
Corsica. Corsica is a dominant story for Napoleon of all his life, but particularly now for the next 18 months and indeed for the next 3, 4, 5 years. Napoleon is going back and forth between his military unit while the country is in revolution, the country that's not quite his, France, to Corsica. It looks, and his family is very involved in the Revolutionary Party in Ajaccio, and his brothers get involved, and Paoli comes back. This upset in Corsica, did they see themselves as an independent nation? Was Napoleon participating militarily eventually because he wanted to separate from France?
Well, he had up until the revolution, but fairly soon after the revolution, he became a revolutionary, a supporter of what the Jacobins were trying to do in France, in entirely remake the whole political process in France. And so this clashed, of course, against the ultra-Catholic, very conservative people who were surrounding Paoli and trying to separate Corsica from Paris. And so, especially this happens, of course, in the religious area that you mentioned earlier, because the Paris government, the Jacobin government, wanted to denationalize the church, the Catholic Church, and this was what had Corsicans in uproar.
Napoleon is unsuccessful in Corsica for various reasons having to do with storming the fortress and political machinations around him. At this point, he's so long away from his unit, he's a deserter. But he heads to Paris because he's looking for work, and he just happens to be there, a bit like Zelig, when the mob storms the Tuileries and forces the king to humiliate himself. What does Napoleon make of that?
Well, he despises the king for allowing himself to be, even though emotionally and politically, he supports the revolutionaries. He also, at the same time, hates the mob. He has been putting down, riots and things in southern France, but he has this sense that the mob is a febrile, untrustworthy, dangerous force, and all of his emotions are those of the army officer, which is to equate it with mutiny and put it down violently. And he thinks the king should have fired on the mob, but he didn't. And instead, of course, Louis XVI eventually paid for it with his life.
Right. In the summer of '92, they storm the Tuileries, and then the mob returns in August, and the Swiss Guard is massacred. That's important to Napoleon because later on, as we will see, he faces a mob as well when he's defending the National Assembly. There are bullet holes in the Tuileries that later on he has removed because he doesn't want the memory of the defeat of the king. This man is going back and forth between the world from kingship and the world from revolutionary. But there's another episode in Corsica. One more time. This is in '93. Despite all of the turmoil in Paris, he's going back to Corsica because there's a family dispute. Actually, it's an exhausting story about a mulberry stand of trees. Is that what it is? It was the mulberries.
Yes, it's a mulberry orchard which his father bought with borrowed money, borrowed from the state, and which he couldn't get to turn a profit, and therefore and then his father died and left the family very badly in debt, and are still unable to make this mulberry orchard pay. So he spent more time at the time of the revolution worrying about the mulberry orchard than he did about what was going on in Paris, really. Back and forth between Paris and Corsica and Paris, but eventually he's going back and forth. There's so much turmoil, it's good not to be in Paris for very long. They're changing sides all the time. April of '93 is important because this is the date that the Girondin, the French general, defects to the Austrians, who become the first of many enemies that France will have. And Robespierre is then guillotining Girondins, traitors everywhere. This is a way of talking about you betrayed the revolution. Napoleon is moving back and forth, and he moves very close to Robespierre, to his brother. Is that dangerous, Andrew? Very dangerous, because in July 1794, when the Jacobins fall, some 60 Jacobins are all scooped up and beheaded, including Augustin Robespierre and his brother Maximilian. At that point, Napoleon has moved close to the brother. In fact, I think he used him as a courier at one point when he's writing new plans to conquer northern Italy. There's a self-invention process, and I follow your story very carefully. Does Napoleon feel that this turmoil in France is his best chance to become Alexander? Does he write about that? Well, not immediately, because he's flung in jail as a Jacobin and had to spend had to spend a fortnight or so in jail before he was able to get out. So there was a perfectly good chance that if the revolution, the anti-Jacobins had been as vicious as the Jacobins had been during the Reign of Terror, he'd have had his head chopped off, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. But nonetheless, he did get out and managed politically to survive and move on to his great scheme, which was to reimpose French power in northern Italy.
Right. This is wonderful because he is given an expedition. This is March of 95. This very short period of time, Napoleon is going back and forth. He's frantically busy all the time. He writes all the time. That's why there are 33,000 letters. He also doesn't hold your politics against you because people are changing sides so quickly. I have down he had 15 ships, 1,174 guns, 16,900 men, but he didn't account for the Royal Navy. This will become a theme throughout the Napoleon years, and you've solved it for me, Andrew. Why France was always losing to the famous Royal Navy. Napoleon didn't care about it.
Yes, Napoleon was a terrible landlubber. He didn't even understand the difference between windward and leeward, as is clear from his letters. He won 60 battles in his life. Not a single one of them was at sea. And the Royal Navy at that time was at its absolute peak of efficiency. It was always out at sea blockading French ports. The British have been at war with the French since 1792, but really over the last century for about 60% of the time. And they were able to fire broadsides 3 times a minute, whereas the French were lucky to get 1 or 2 shots off. So frankly, he was never going to be able to pull off an expedition against Corsica in the way when there were as many Royal Naval ships as he had. But that was the reason he was humiliated on that occasion.
Our hero is 139th on the list of generals after he's switched to the right side in charge of Paris. And when we come back, our hero is going to meet Josephine. The book is Napoleon. Andrew Roberts is the author, A Life of Napoleon. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. Andrew Roberts' magnificent book, Napoleon, A Life. This is young Napoleon, and we've reached 95 in Paris. Napoleon is unemployed. He's looking for work. He's actually thinking of starting a family. He's writing romantic letters to a woman who will eventually become a Queen of Sweden. But at the time, her mother advises her, one too many Bonapartes in the family already. He's another sister is married into the Bonaparte family. So she spurns him, and he's adrift. He's assigned, however, he entertains going to the Russian army, and he entertains joining the East India Company for the English. He entertains joining the Sultan of Turkey to teach him artillery. But he's assigned to the Topographical Bureau. Was that a good posting, Andrew?
Yes, it was a very good posting. It doesn't sound it, does it? Topographical
No, it didn't.
Bureau.
It didn't when I first read it, right.
And statistical and rather dull backwater. It's the exact opposite. It's the actual nerve centre of the Ministry of War. It's the staff, central staff, and high command.
The convention, that's the ruling body in Paris right now, is aware that it's being threatened of a revolt. This is October of 95, something called the Sections. It's very involved. Napoleon is outside of this, except for the fact that the convention has to be defended. And the man in charge of it is considered very poor. Menu, he's suspect. In fact, his politics are suspect. So they turn to a famous libertine. His name is Barras. Do I say that correctly, Andrew?
Paul Barras, yeah.
That's a magnificent figure. If you hadn't written Napoleon, you might have written Barras. And Barras knows nothing about the military, so he chooses Napoleon. How did he settle on him?
Well, Napoleon had done very well in the siege of Toulon 2 years earlier and had made his name militarily there, and the person who was in charge of the siege of Toulon was a friend of Barras who highlighted Napoleon as an up-and-coming young general.
Now we come to the day in the French calendar, because they remade the calendar, why not? They were new men, into 10-day weeks. Treize Vendémiaire, which is a date in the calendar. It's October. But the mob is approaching the convention, and Napoleon has to defend it. You give a very detailed account. I don't know this geography very well. Did he lay the cannon out to give enfilading fire? In other words, did he lay his cannon out so that he knew when the mob emerged he could slaughter them?
Yes, that's right. He positioned his cannons. The map at the beginning of the book shows the key places where he was able to ensure that if the mob came out towards the convention, which was based at the Tuileries Palace, then he would be able to really massacre the maximum amount of people in the minimum amount of time.
And he did, and he prosecuted. You have a wonderful quote, "The rabble must be moved by terror." That is his opinion of rabble. Where did he first see rabble that he decided that you must be violent and overwhelmingly violent to deal with it?
We mentioned it, do you remember earlier, just before the revolution broke out down in the south of France when he was putting them down, and that's where he got this sense of the rabble being a dangerous force.
He's successful that day, he's brutal that day, but it solves the mob in Paris, and as Andrew writes, for 3 decades it solves the mob in Paris. He's so successful. He's now given a political appointment by Barras. At the same time, he is a man who's charged with censoring the Comédie Française. Also, he confiscates weapons. And is that where he meets Josephine?
Yes, exactly that. He asks for all swords to be handed in, and Josephine's son, Eugène, a young teenager, comes to present his dead father's sword. His father had been a general who'd been guillotined, and the Viscount Beauharnais. And Napoleon uses this opportunity because he's heard about this fabulously sexy and well-placed lady who was also Barras' mistress, Josephine, and takes the opportunity to give the sword back in a gentlemanly gesture.
This relationship requires much more explication than we have time for here. I'll just say that it comes to me that Napoleon, when he met Josephine, was starstruck. Did she even notice him?
Well, she'd heard of him because Barras was pretty keen to get rid of her by this stage. She was
Right.
a very expensive proposition. He'd been picking up her debts for quite a long time, and they thought it was time to move on. So it was very much in Barras' interest that he should find a boyfriend for Josephine, and he picked on the man of the hour, Napoleon.
Josephine is a very strong-willed person, older than Napoleon, and he dotes on her. His letters to her are extremely over-the-top romanticism. It's a treat to go through and see how much of that information is good and how much of it he was passing on to Josephine because he knew she was a gossip and it would be propaganda in his favor. Josephine and Napoleon marry. They marry in a civil contract. Importantly, however, they have a very short honeymoon. Barras, the Directory, now in charge. Do they send Napoleon off to the Army of Italy to lose, or do they think he's a tyro?
Oh, no, they certainly send him off to try and win because they'd love to recapture Italy, but frankly it's a bit of a backwater compared to the real fighting which is taking place in Germany at the time. That's where the war is going to be won or lost, and so he is sent off to Italy, but nobody expects him to do terribly well there, and they don't give him any money to
they give him less to do the Army of Italy than they pay him in a year as a general salary.
Yes, can you imagine? It was a pathetic sort of drop in the bucket. And so he had to try to scrabble for everything he got in those early stages.
The man who wins 60 battles hasn't won his first battle yet, and he's on his way to the Army of Italy. This is the end of the young Napoleon. He's about to become an extremely overwhelming battlefield commander. But one story before we turn to the commands. Andrew, you say that there was so little money that he gambled to increase the allotment for the army. Is that confirmed?
It's one of the rumours. I hope that the way I presented it to the reader did imply that it's not confirmed.
I know, but I liked it a lot, Andrew, just as I like all your stories. I like the idea that he wagered his swords to feed his army. The book is Napoleon Alive, Andrew Roberts. When we speak next, we'll be speaking of Napoleon in the field. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show.